All right, everybody, welcome back. Today, we're going to dive deep into something I think you're going to find really useful. We're looking at how to learn more effectively and actually remember what you learn.
Yeah, this should be good.
So to do that, we've got this book, Yundu, which translates to super learning in English.
Catchy title.
Right. And, plus a ton of articles, research, all that good stuff. You guys send in so many good resources on this topic. So what we're aiming for today is to give you those key strategies to help you kind of learn smarter, not harder, no more just pushing through and feeling overwhelmed.
I like that. Learn smarter, not harder.
Yeah, because honestly, who decided learning had to be such a drag?
Right? Like it should be fun to learn.
Exactly. And if we understand how our brains really work, then learning can become a much smoother, more enjoyable, and rewarding experience.
I think that's so key, and it's one of the most fascinating takeaways from all these resources you've gathered. It's like from the practical tips in super learning to the hardcore cognitive science in the research articles, it all points to the same idea. Effective learning isn't about just raw willpower. It's about working with your brain, not against it. Aligning with how it's naturally wired to learn and remember.
So should we start with the basics? Like, what are those essential conditions for effective learning?
Let's do it.
One thing that keeps popping up everywhere is the importance of our attention span. You know how TED Talks are capped at 18 minutes?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I've heard that's not just some random rule, right?
Exactly. And there's all this research saying the average adult attention span is around 15 minutes, sometimes even shorter, especially at the very beginning of trying to focus on something.
That 18-minute format is totally in sync with how our focus naturally shifts, Think of attention like a spotlight. It can only stay super bright for so long. Then it needs to dim a bit, refocus, It needs a little break. And all that research you mentioned, that totally backs this up. Our attention spans are like a muscle. They get tired.
Makes total sense.
So trying to force yourself to concentrate for hours on end, it just doesn't work. You end up learning less effectively.
And this is where learning in short bursts becomes so important.
Absolutely. In fact, Ellen Dunn, she's a researcher at LSU, she recommends study sessions of 30 to 50 minutes, followed by short breaks, like 5 to 10 minutes.
So much more manageable than those marathon study sessions that just leave you feeling drained.
Right. And there's this other thing to consider, too, kind of a bigger picture thing. Have you heard of the 90-minute ultradian rhythm?
Rings a bell.
Yeah, it was discovered by these researchers, Dement and Kleitman. Basically, it's like your energy levels throughout the day. They have their own mini cycles, like tides going in and out.
So we're talking about those natural energy dips we all experience, even when we've had enough sleep.
Exactly. These cycles, from being super alert and productive to needing a break, they happen whether we're awake or asleep. So if you can learn to recognize your own rhythm, you can time your learning to match your peak focus times.
Work with your natural energy, not against it.
Exactly. And then, take breaks when your energy naturally dips.
Okay, so breaking down learning into these manageable chunks, that just makes so much sense. It's like we're telling our brains, hey, we're going to tackle this complex topic step by step.
Right. Not in one massive bite.
And this leads us to long-term planning, right?
Yeah.
Making a study schedule that actually works with our natural rhythms.
Yes. And it's not just about filling in time slots, it's about being strategic.
Like figuring out whether you're a morning person or a night owl.
Yeah. Like when are you most alert and focused?
And making sure you're getting enough sleep, eating properly, all the things that affect how well our brains function.
Absolutely. It's all connected.
So those learning blocks, those 30 to 50 minutes, followed by the 5 to 15-minute breaks, they're not set in stone.
Right. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
We can adjust them based on what works best for us.
Exactly. Some people might find they focus best in even shorter bursts, like 30 minutes. And that's fine. The sources really emphasize flexibility. Find what works for you.
Like the Pomodoro technique, right?
Yep, exactly. That's a great example. 25 minutes of focused work, then a 5-minute break.
Okay, so we've talked about attention spans, scheduling. What about how we actually process information? There's this recurring theme about prioritizing understanding over just trying to memorize everything.
Yeah, and there's some really interesting research on this. Have you heard of Roger Selyew?
Not ringing a bell.
So back in 1979, he did this study where he talked about 2 types of learning: surface learning and deep learning. Surface learning is all about memorizing facts, without really understanding the bigger picture.
Okay, so it's like knowing a bunch of facts but not really getting how they fit together.
Exactly. And then there's deep learning, which is about really understanding the concepts, seeing the connections, making meaning of the information.
So deep learning is more about the why behind the what.
Exactly. And while memorization definitely has its uses, for most learning, it's focusing on understanding that leads to better memory and the ability to actually use what you've learned.
It's like the difference between knowing the steps in a recipe and understanding why those steps work, what makes the dish turn out the way it does. If you understand the why, you can adapt and improvise. You're not just blindly following instructions.
Perfect analogy. And you know, another thing that came up a lot in the research is this idea of patterns and connections. Our brains are wired to look for patterns. It helps us make sense of the world.
Right, like we're always trying to connect the dots to see how things fit together.
Exactly. And that's why starting with those big concepts, the overarching ideas, that's so important.
It gives us that framework, that mental map, to hang all the smaller details on.
Exactly. They're not just isolated bits of information anymore. They have a place in that bigger picture.
The example that really stuck with me was the Miranda rights. Just memorizing the names of those Supreme Court justices and the exact dates of the rulings, that's one thing. But truly understanding the principles behind a defendant's rights, the procedures the police have to follow, that's a whole other level.
It is. And that kind of understanding allows you to reason through different legal scenarios, even if you don't remember every single detail.
Because you understand the underlying logic, the why behind those rights.
Precisely. And this is all part of what's called concept learning. It's the ability to categorize information based on key features and then to integrate new information into those categories.
So it's about building this mental framework, this system of categories that helps us organize and make sense of new information.
Exactly. It's not just a memory trick. It's a skill that gets better with practice. The book compares it to learning to cook,
Yeah.
If you just follow recipes without understanding why you're doing certain things.
You're limited, right?
Right. But if you understand why you saute onions a certain way or why you simmer a sauce for a specific amount of time.
Then you can start improvising. You can create your own dishes.
Exactly. You become a true chef, not just someone who follows instructions. And there's something else that's kind of similar to concept learning. It's called heuristics.
Heuristics.
Yeah, they're like mental shortcuts, rules of thumb that help us make decisions and solve problems based on past experience, Like, if you're trying to write an essay, a good heuristic might be to always start by outlining your main points.
So it's like using a framework from one situation to approach a new one.
Exactly. And this all ties back to the idea that there are more effective ways to learn, ways to solidify those concepts. Like there's something called the Feynman technique.
Oh, yeah, we'll definitely have to talk about that. But first, I want to touch on something that might seem a little counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Embracing failure as part of the learning process.
Yeah, that one's a bit of a mind bender. It's all about this concept of productive failure.
Productive failure. Okay, I'm intrigued.
It's based on the work of Manu Kapoor. He did this research where he compared two groups of students. One group got tons of support while they were trying to solve problems, step-by-step guidance. The other group, they had to figure things out on their own, mostly through collaboration, without all the hand-holding.
And I'm guessing the group that struggled a bit more actually learned more in the end.
You got it. Even though they didn't always get the right answers at first, they developed a much deeper understanding of the concepts.
So their initial struggles actually helped them learn more effectively.
Exactly, because they had to grapple with the problems, try different approaches, really think things through, and they were able to apply that deeper understanding later on, even to new problems. Now, Kapoor does say there are 3 key conditions for this to work.
Okay, what are those?
First, the problems have to be challenging but not impossible. Like that sweet spot where it's tough but not overwhelming.
Got it. What's the second condition?
Learners need to have a chance to explain their thinking, why they chose a certain approach, what their reasoning was.
So it's not just about getting the right answer. It's about understanding the process, the thought process behind it.
Yes. And the third condition, they need to be able to compare their solutions to other people's solutions, to see different approaches, different ways of thinking about the problem.
This reminds me of that whole debate about overparenting, how constantly shielding kids from making mistakes can actually hurt them in the long run.
It's a great parallel. We instinctively want to avoid making errors, but those mistakes, they can be incredibly valuable learning experiences. It's all about adopting a growth mindset where those failures are opportunities to learn and grow.
The sources really emphasize this idea of documenting your learning journey, even when things don't go as planned, like keeping a journal of your progress, noting those aha moments, but also those times when you hit a roadblock. It's all data.
Absolutely. Think of it like a scientist keeping meticulous notes on an experiment, recording the successes but also the unexpected results. Those failures, they can reveal crucial insights that help you refine your approach and ultimately improve your understanding.
Like in gardening, right? Every mistake, every plant that doesn't thrive, teaches you something about the soil, the sunlight, the watering needs.
Exactly. And the same principle applies to learning any new skill. Those setbacks, those times when you don't get it right, they can be the most valuable learning opportunities. You just have to reframe your perspective and see them as data points, as feedback that helps you improve.
So we've covered the essential conditions for effective learning, the importance of understanding over rote memorization, and even the value of embracing productive failure. Now, let's dive into the science of memory itself. How can we hold on to what we learn and prevent it from fading away?
This is where understanding the three main stages of memory comes in: encoding, storage, and retrieval. Think of it like saving a file on your computer.
Okay, I like that analogy.
So first, you have encoding, which is like taking a picture or typing in information. It's the initial processing of information through our senses. Then you have storage, which is like saving that file to your hard drive, moving the information from that temporary short-term memory to long-term storage. And finally, retrieval is like opening that file when you need it, accessing that stored information.
And it's so interesting that what we often think of as a bad memory might actually be more of an attention problem during that initial encoding stage. Like if you're distracted while reading something, or if you only half listen when someone introduces themselves.
It's not that you can't remember it later, it's that you didn't really process it deeply in the first place.
The information just never got properly encoded.
Exactly. And, the level of attention you pay to something directly impacts how strong that memory trace is, whether it makes it into that long-term storage.
And we can't forget about retrieval practice. That's so crucial for strengthening those memories and making them easier to access later on.
Oh, absolutely. The sources talk about the three main ways we retrieve memories. There's recall, which is like remembering something without any hints, like remembering someone's name out of the blue.
That's the strongest form of retrieval, right?
It is, but it's also the most challenging. Then there's recognition, which is like remembering something with a cue, like recognizing someone's face in a crowd.
And that's the kind of retrieval we use most often in everyday life, right?
It is. And then there's relearning, which is basically starting from scratch. It's like having to reread a book you've already read because you've forgotten most of it.
And that's the least efficient way to learn, right?
It is. You're basically retracing your steps, which takes more time and energy. Which brings us to the infamous forgetting curve.
Ah, yes, the bane of every student's existence.
Hermann Ebbinghaus, he mapped out this curve that shows just how quickly we forget things if we don't make an effort to remember them. It's kind of scary, actually. Like after only 4 days, we might forget half of what we learned.
And after a week, it's even worse, right?
Yeah, it's down to like 30%. But here's the good news. We can combat that forgetting curve with regular review.
So it's not just about learning something once. It's about coming back to it, revisiting that information.
Exactly. Every time you review something, you're basically telling your brain, hey, this is important, hold on to this. And each review strengthens that memory trace, making it less likely to fade.
So consistent review is key, not just for tests, but for truly retaining information long term.
Absolutely. Now, Ebbinghaus did find that two main factors influence how quickly we forget things. The first is the initial strength of the memory, how much attention we paid to it in the first place. And the second factor is time. How long has it been since we learned the information? Those are things we can't always control. But what we can control is the frequency of our review.
Okay, so while it's great to be able to recall information perfectly from scratch, the sources suggest focusing on improving our recognition skills, becoming more adept at using cues and prompts in our everyday lives. Like, you might not be able to recite a whole presentation from memory, but you'll likely recognize the key points when you see them again later.
Exactly. And, all of this understanding about how memory works, it sets the stage for using more effective learning strategies like what the sources call the learning cycle.
Okay, break it down for us.
So the learning cycle, it's basically a sequence of techniques for getting the most out of your study time. It includes previewing, attending, reviewing, studying, evaluating, and then repeating the whole cycle.
Okay, I can see how that would be effective, but let's go through each step in a bit more detail. What does previewing involve?
Previewing is about getting a general overview of the material before you really dive in. So skim those headings, subheadings, look at any visuals or diagrams, read the conclusions, just get a sense of the big picture first.
Okay, create that mental map, right? Then what's next?
Then you have attending, which is all about active engagement.
So this is where those focused study sessions come in.
Exactly. Take notes, ask yourself questions, really try to make connections. Then there's reviewing. This is about taking a few minutes right after you've studied something to look back over what you've just covered, kind of like a mini recap to reinforce those memories. Then comes studying, where you really dig deep into the material, spend those focused 30 to 50 minutes working with it, trying to make sense of it.
And this is where those other techniques like concept learning and elaborative interrogation would come into play, right?
Exactly. And then finally, there's evaluating. This is about checking your progress, seeing how much you've actually learned. You can do this with practice tests, quizzes, past papers, or even just by trying to explain the concepts to yourself or someone else.
And the key is that it's a cycle, right?
Yes, you're constantly going back and forth, engaging with the material in different ways, reinforcing those memories, deepening your understanding. It's not a one-time thing, it's an ongoing process.
It's about active engagement, not passive absorption.
Precisely. And you know, this all ties into another incredibly powerful learning technique, retrieval practice.
Okay, we touched on that earlier, but I'm ready to dive deeper.
So retrieval practice is all about actively pulling knowledge out of your brain rather than just trying to cram more in.
And this active effort actually strengthens our memories, right?
It does. It's like exercising a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. The classic example of retrieval practice is flashcards.
Ah, yes, the old standby. But I have a feeling you're going to tell us there's a more effective way to use them than just flipping through them mindlessly.
You know me too well. The key is to actively try to recall the answer before you look at the back of the card.
So don't just passively read the question and then flip it over. Really force yourself to come up with the answer first.
Exactly. Even if you get it wrong, that mental effort of trying to retrieve the information strengthens that memory trace. And there's some pretty compelling research to back this up. Pooja Agarwal, she did this study in a middle school social studies class, and she found that even low-stakes quizzes, just simple retrieval practice, led to students performing significantly better on tests.
Really? Even when the quizzes didn't count towards their grades?
Exactly. And they found something else really interesting. Recall questions, where you have to generate the answer yourself. They're even more effective than recognition questions, like multiple choice.
Makes sense. The more effort you put into retrieving information, the more likely you are to remember it later. So we've got flashcards, quizzes, any other tips for making retrieval practice more effective?
The sources suggest getting creative with it, like try rewriting the concepts in your own words as simply as you can, or explain them as if you were telling a story, or even draw a diagram.
So it's about finding ways to actively interact with the material, to make it your own.
Exactly. The more you can do to make the information meaningful, the more likely you are to remember it.
This leads us nicely to the next technique, spaced repetition. And this one, it directly combats that forgetting curve we talked about earlier.
It does. So instead of cramming all your studying into one long session, you spread it out over time with longer and longer intervals between reviews.
It's kind of like strength training for your brain, right?
Perfect analogy. You wouldn't lift weights for hours on end without giving your muscles a chance to recover and grow stronger, right?
Rest is crucial.
Exactly. And it's the same with our brains. Those spaced out repetitions give those neural connections time to solidify. The sources actually provide a sample weekly schedule, and it shows how even short review sessions, maybe totaling 75 minutes over a work, can lead to much better long-term retention than cramming everything into one sitting.
So quality over quantity when it comes to review.
Yes. And that's why cramming is so ineffective. You're just not giving your brain a chance to process the information deeply to make those lasting connections.
It's all surface level learning.
Exactly. The focus needs to be on frequency of review, not just duration. Even if you are in a last-minute situation, you can try to apply these principles by breaking your study sessions into shorter bursts, mixing up the order of what you review, and actively trying to recall information during each session.
Okay, so we've uncovered some incredibly effective learning techniques based on the science of how our brains work. But what about those traditional study habits that we've all used? The ones that feel productive but might actually not be the best use of our time?
This is where John Dunlosky's research comes in. He did this huge study back in 2013 where he evaluated the effectiveness of 10 common learning techniques. And they found that 5 of them were actually less beneficial than we might think.
Okay, spill the beans. Which ones are we talking about?
Summarization, highlighting, mnemonics, using imagery for text learning, and rereading.
Those are like the staples of studying. So many of us have relied on these techniques for years.
I know, right? It's kind of surprising. So with summarization, it can be helpful, but only if you've been specifically trained in how to do it effectively. For most people, it ends up being a pretty passive activity, and it doesn't really lead to deeper understanding. Highlighting, it's visually appealing, but research suggests it can be distracting, and it doesn't necessarily force you to process the information more deeply. Mnemonics, they can be great for quick recall of keywords or lists, but they're not as helpful for understanding complex concepts. Using imagery for learning text, it has potential, but the benefits seem to be limited, and it works best with text that's already very visual. And then rereading, it's super common, but unless you're spacing out those rereadings, it doesn't really do much for understanding or recall.
So the common thread here is that these techniques are often quite passive. They don't require us to actively engage with the material.
Exactly. They give us a false sense of familiarity, but they don't really help us learn and remember.
So what are the 5 techniques that Dunlosky and his team found were the most effective?
The top 5 were practice testing, which we already talked about, distributed practice, which is spaced repetition, and then elaborative interrogation, self-explanation, and interleaved practice.
Okay, we've covered practice testing and distributed practice, so let's dig into those last 3. What is elaborative interrogation?
Elaborative interrogation, it's all about asking why. Why is this fact true? Why does this concept work this way? It's about forcing yourself to generate explanations, not just accepting information passively. Michael Presley, a researcher who studied this technique, found that it can be really effective, especially for factual information.
So it's about going beyond just knowing something is true to understanding why it's true.
Exactly. And self-explanation, it's kind of similar. It's about using your own prior knowledge to make sense of new information. Like you might compare a new concept to something you already understand, or you might try to teach the concept to someone else.
The sources talked about using analogies, right? Like comparing a scientific process to a recipe.
Yes, and there's this fascinating study from the University of Waterloo where they found that saying information out loud was even more effective for memory than just reading it silently or writing it down.
Really, just the act of speaking it makes that much of a difference.
It does. It forces you to engage with the information in a more active way. They even suggest a simple 4-step technique. Underline the key concepts, read them aloud, take a 3-minute break, then test your recall.
That's a really easy technique to implement.
Right. It's all about finding ways to make the learning process more active and engaging.
And then there's the Feynman technique, which is kind of like a specific application of self-explanation.
It is, and it's so simple but so effective. It's named after Richard Feynman, the physicist, and it's all about identifying those gaps in your understanding.
Okay, walk us through it. How does it work?
So the first step, you pick a concept you want to learn.
Let's say gravity.
Perfect. So you write down an explanation of gravity as simply as you can, as if you were explaining it to someone who's never heard of it before.
Okay, so no jargon, no technical terms.
Right. Use everyday language. And as you're writing, you'll probably find yourself stumbling, realizing that you don't fully understand certain parts, and those are your blind spots. So the third step, you go back to your learning materials and focus on those areas where you struggled. And finally, if you can, try to create an analogy, a simple example, to illustrate the concept.
So with gravity, you might compare it to a bowling ball on a trampoline, how it creates a dip that pulls other objects towards it.
Exactly. It's a way to demonstrate that you really understand the concept, not just the definition.
And this leads us to the last technique we want to cover. Interleaved practice.
This one can feel a bit counterintuitive, but the research is pretty clear that it's more effective than blocked practice.
Okay, remind us, what's blocked practice again?
Blocked practice is what most of us naturally do. It's like practicing one skill or studying one topic until you feel like you've mastered it, and then moving on to the next one.
Okay, so with math, you might practice all your addition problems, then all your subtraction problems, and so on.
Exactly. But interleaved practice is different. It's about mixing things up. You might do a few addition problems, then a few subtraction problems, then a few multiplication problems, and then repeat that cycle.
So you're constantly switching back and forth between different but related concepts or skills.
Exactly. And research has shown that this can lead to significantly better learning and retention. In some studies, interleaving led to improvements of up to 43% compared to blocked practice.
Wow. That's a huge difference. Why is interleaving so effective?
Well, it forces your brain to work harder. When you switch between tasks, you have to actively retrieve the correct information and the right strategy for each one. You can't just go on autopilot.
It's like a built-in retrieval practice session.
Exactly. And this deeper processing leads to stronger memories.
So with interleaving, you're not just learning the individual skills or concepts, you're also learning how to discriminate between them, to choose the right approach for the right situation.
Precisely. It's about building a more flexible and adaptable understanding.
And this ties back to the importance of understanding overrote memorization, right? You're not just mindlessly following steps, you're thinking critically about which steps to take when.
Exactly. Now, it's important to note that you don't want to interleave too broadly. Stick to related subjects within a study session.
So you wouldn't mix chemistry, literature, and pottery all together.
No, that would be too much. But you might interleave different concepts within chemistry or different themes within a literature course.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked a lot about different techniques, different strategies, but there's another key ingredient in effective learning that we can't ignore: motivation. The sources briefly mentioned this idea of making learning a secondary goal by tapping into intrinsic motivation.
Yes, and this is so powerful. It's about finding that deeper reason for learning, something that genuinely excites you, something that makes the learning itself feel more meaningful. There's this great quote by Einstein about how time seems to disappear when you're fully engrossed in something you love. That's the kind of motivation we're talking about.
It's like those times when you get so caught up in a project, a hobby, a game, that you completely lose track of time.
Exactly. And in those moments, you're often learning without even realizing it. You're driven by a goal that's bigger than the learning itself.
I love the example from the movie Karate Kid. Daniel didn't realize he was learning karate while he was painting fences and waxing cars.
Perfect example. The learning was embedded in the pursuit of a larger goal.
So it's about finding ways to connect the things we need to learn to something we're already passionate about.
Exactly. If you can tap into that intrinsic motivation, learning stops feeling like a chore and starts feeling more like a natural part of achieving something you genuinely care about. The sources emphasize that motivation is one of the most powerful learning tools we have.
So it's not just about the techniques, it's about the why behind the learning.
Yes. If you have a strong enough why, the how becomes much easier.
So instead of just thinking, I have to learn this for a test, it's about finding a way to connect the learning to a goal that matters to you personally.
Exactly. Like maybe you want to travel to a foreign country and be able to speak the language.
Or maybe you want to start a business and you need to learn about marketing and finance.
Yes. Or maybe you just want to be able to play your favorite song on the guitar.
It's about finding that spark, that thing that makes you want to learn, not because you have to, but because you want to.
Precisely. And, you know, the sources do acknowledge that sometimes you just have to buckle down and do the work, even if you're not feeling super motivated. They suggest a couple of techniques for those times. One is the 10-minute rule. Basically, if you're dreading a task, just commit to doing it for 10 minutes.
And often, once you get started, you'll find yourself getting into it.
Exactly. And if you still want to stop after 10 minutes, that's fine, but often you'll find yourself wanting to keep going. Another technique is the 2/3 rule.
Tell us about that one.
So it's about dividing your learning time into thirds. 1/3 for reading, researching, taking in information passively, and then 2/3 for active application.
So it's about putting what you've learned into practice.
Exactly. Learning by doing is much more effective than just passively absorbing information.
And all of this ties back to the idea that learning is most effective when it's driven by a genuine desire to understand, to achieve a goal, just like Einstein with his lifelong pursuit of understanding the universe.
Precisely. And the sources even hinted at this concept of 6 levels of understanding. It didn't go into detail, but it's a fascinating idea. Like, just being able to explain something is just one level. There's so much more to true mastery.
That definitely sounds like a topic for another deep dive. But it highlights the idea that learning shouldn't be about just accumulating facts or passing tests.
Right. It should be about deepening our understanding, about expanding our knowledge and our abilities.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating exploration of effective learning. It's clear that the way we've traditionally been taught to learn often goes against how our brains are actually wired. Prioritizing understanding, embracing productive failure, and using those active learning techniques like retrieval practice and spaced repetition, that's what really makes a difference.
I completely agree. It's all about working with our brains.